Hello again. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives on South African roads this festive season. What's even more alarming is that a large number of deaths are pedestrian-related. Negligent and reckless driving is a cause for concern, no doubt. So what happens if you run over a pedestrian, and what does the law say? To help us understand this issue, I'm joined in the studio by attorney Vanessa De Silva Faria, who joins us here. Joining us also via Skype from Wisconsin in the United States is Stan Bezuidenhout, an accident reconstruction expert. A very good morning to both of you. Stan, perhaps let me start with you, and let's play out a scenario. You're driving on a dark road and you happen to hit a pedestrian. Now, you're not even sure whether you've hit a person, you're not sure what it is that you hit, but you're feeling unsafe, so you drive away. What happens?
Well, it's very interesting. I'm actually working a matter exactly like that at the moment that I'm busy testifying in. One of the most important things that people don't understand is that they are bound by the Criminal Procedures Act or the laws of South Africa. So if you leave the scene of a collision, no matter your situation at the moment, the only option you have is to head straight to the nearest police station. If you just leave and you wait till tomorrow or the next day or whatever, the chances are that you're going to be charged with failing to stop, failing to ensure that parties aren't injured, etc. So it starts with your responsibility. You need to do the right thing.
You need to do the right thing. What happens, Vanessa, you're on a national road? We know that pedestrians should not be on a national road. So you're thinking, I mean, this is a road that I use to go home or to school or to work every single day. You're not expecting a pedestrian to cross. Are you still in the wrong?
Unfortunately, in terms of our laws, you are, up until you're proven that you were not in any manner whatsoever acting negligent during that scenario. So Stan is completely correct. You know, the duty is on you to go to the police station, inform the police of what has happened, but you also need to ensure that in the statement you make to the police, you need to ensure that you're not incriminating yourself. You need to ensure that you're not, you know, showing that you were actually negligent in the manner in which you conducted yourself during those circumstances. So, of course, you don't expect a pedestrian to be there, but, you know, there's a duty on you as a driver to keep a proper lookout and to act reasonably and to, you know, ensure that you're complying with all the rules of the road and to ensure that you're taking every person into consideration that's on the road, especially a pedestrian that you might not expect. And unfortunately, the duty is on you to show that you were not acting negligent, because if it's shown that you were negligent, then you can find yourself in a lot of trouble in terms of our law, especially in terms of our criminal law, where you could even be found charged of reckless and negligent driving and possibly culpable homicide if the pedestrian has died or, you know, has been injured in a certain way.
Stan, what factors does the court look out for in determining what kind of punishment is meted out against you?
Well, as far as the punishment is concerned, it is typically governed by prior trial findings, so-called reference law, etc. But what's more important are the elements the courts will consider when they prosecute you. Now, as a former specialist police officer, it was my job to actually arrest those people and charge them. And the elements are typically the following. The first and most important thing is an element called taking due care, or operating your vehicle with due regard to the prevailing conditions. So if it's at night on a remote road where lighting is poor and you can't see well, you can't be driving at over the speed limit, and in certain conditions not even at 100 kilometers per hour. So it's extremely important that you become aware of your environment, that you think to yourself, what can I do to avoid a collision? The second thing they look at is so-called malice and forethought. That is whether you acted in a way that you, and the term to be used is if you reconcile yourself with the eventual outcome, and that includes a fatality or an injury. That means you acted in a way that if you thought about it carefully, you'd know that if I hit a pedestrian right now, I would probably be in the wrong. Then you had malice and forethought. You had an opportunity to plan ahead, and how you do that affects the outcome of the trial.
Sure. Vanessa, you mentioned something before we even get to the courts. I'd like us to go back. When you go to the police station and you report that this incident has happened, you said make sure you don't incriminate yourself. How do you not incriminate yourself?
Well, that's the thing, and it's a difficult thing to do, especially for a lay person who's, not aware of what the laws say, and they don't really know how to formulate a statement that protects them in their entirety. But, the most important thing when you give your statement is you need to tell the truth, you need to explain what happened, but you also need to explain the surrounding circumstances. So you need to explain, for example, that it was a dark area, you were not speeding, you were driving as slow as possible, you were being very cautious, but there was a person who all of a sudden, for example, ran through the road, and you did not expect a person to run through the road. The circumstances of the manner in which the road is shaped, or what the road looks like, or what's around you, would imply that you could also not reasonably be aware of the fact that a person would just simply run across the road. So you need to, paint the picture, and you need to ensure that the police officer understands the situation that you were in. Of course, if you were acting negligently, if you were speeding, or if you were perhaps intoxicated and you weren't paying attention, then that's a different issue. Then I suggest you'd probably need to get legal representation immediately to assist you with something like that. The most important thing, though, is you need to ensure that you report the incident as soon as possible. And also, if you are injured yourself, or if you're a bit shaken up, then obviously first go to a doctor, perhaps obtain legal advice, and then immediately report the incident.
Right. Stan, what is it that police look out for, especially when it comes to your vehicle? Can they test your vehicle to see if you had a functioning hooter? Can they test your vehicle to see if your tires were okay? Do they consider those factors?
Yes, absolutely, and that's a very vital component. People tend to not realize that when you are charged with a criminal offense, everything that could affect the outcome is considered. A good example would be a person who has a poorly maintained vehicle, perhaps a headlamp doesn't work properly, or not at all. In that instance, you are operating a vehicle that is not in compliance with the National Road Traffic Act, and therefore everything you do with that vehicle exposes you to additional risk. So if the police officer examines your vehicle and finds that your lights are not working, or the vehicle wasn't roadworthy, or your tires are smooth, or whatever the case, the onus moves to you again. People need to understand that everything you do can and will be used against you in a court of law. It doesn't only go to the statement, it also goes to the condition of your vehicle, your state of intoxication, if that is an issue, etc. So people need to understand that the only way in which we can avoid collisions is to try and plan to avoid them, not to try to explain why you couldn't. I know, and I agree, that you get something called a sudden emergency. That is where something happens so rapidly and so unpredictably that you had no reasonable chance to avoid it. But if any of those elements can be eliminated, it becomes more difficult for you to defend yourself against criminal charges.
Sure. Vanessa, it would seem that pedestrians enjoy more rights than drivers.
Well, it depends on the circumstances, but it's not necessarily that they enjoy more rights. I think they're at this point in time, there are ipso facto more protected than what a driver is. There's just a duty on a driver to prove that they did not act in a negligent or in an unreasonable manner. Once a driver is able to prove that, then they're also protected themselves.
Is compassion a factor when you go to the court? So if you did something and you knocked someone down and you actually take responsibility, you call the police, you call an ambulance, you actually go with them to the hospital to check if they're okay, you make sure that their family members know that this is what happened. Is that considered in the courts?
It's definitely considered, but it unfortunately will not prevent you from being charged with a criminal offence and possibly from being found guilty of a criminal offence. The compassion then falls in as to what your possible sentence might be if you've reached that point. But, the courts do respect people who do that, who take responsibility over the situation and who do not just simply try to run away from it. If you run away from it and if you actually show that you don't care about what's happened, it just puts you in a worse position at the end of the day.
Right. Stan, I'd like us to end off by drawing parallels between South Africa and where you are in the United States in terms of road fatalities, the high numbers that we see here. Do you see that there? In terms of the laws that are in America, in terms of how stringent is it for drivers and pedestrians? What are we looking like if we had to compare the two?
Well, I can tell you right from the outset that the element of law and the mechanics of law in the USA is completely different from the mechanics of law in South Africa. For starters, in the USA, drivers are held accountable under a different set of rules. And more importantly, in the USA, even pedestrians can be held accountable. A good example would be if a pedestrian crosses a road on say, a national road in South Africa and is struck by the vehicle, I suppose you can say the onus of responsibility still rests with the vehicle operator. However, in the USA, if a pedestrian crosses the road on a national road where they are not allowed to be, the chances are that the pedestrian might face consequences. And even where they pass away, the driver has a lower burden of proof because the pedestrian acted illegally. The law is followed much more to the letter and argued completely differently. Most trials are also concluded much quicker, and the level of investigation is just in a completely different world. If I look back over the 20 years I spent in South Africa and the extent to which crashes are investigated there versus the 6 months I've spent in the USA and the way they are investigated here and the time I've spent in trial, South Africa has a very long way to go before the mechanisms of law and the drivers in South Africa can properly adjust to an international standard or norm.
Thank you very much to both of my guests. Quite a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much, Vanessa, and thank you, Stan, in Wisconsin, for us on road usage and knowing your rights and knowing when you are wrong as well.